If you want to capture incredible action shots or even just a simple beautifully sharp portrait of a perch bird, it's not enough to just press the shutter button and hope for the best. Even with the most advanced cameras and autofocus systems, you need to follow a few critical steps to ensure that you end up with stunning and in-focus razor-sharp images. A few of the things I'm going to share with you today you probably never heard of before. Some might even sound a little bit crazy, but trust me, they work. My name is Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. Each week I bring you essential field techniques, in-depth camera reviews, powerful editing tips, and the latest camera news, helping you to level up your own photography game. Of course, to get fantastic autofocusing results, we need to make sure that we have dialed in the correct camera settings and autofocusing settings within our camera bodies, but this is actually not what I want to focus on today. I've done many different setup videos over the years and will do many more in the future, and I've also linked a few PDF setup guides for you down there in the description that should help you to dial in the correct autofocusing settings. But there are more important steps that you can actually take in order to be successful in the field, and that's what we're going to look at today. Even if you use the latest and greatest camera gear like this Canon R1 for instance, you still have to make sure that you help your camera in the field as much as possible. Over the years I've seen people get very upset with their camera gear and blame it for not getting the sharp shots that they want, when in fact it's poor technique that's letting them down and the camera is perfectly fine. The first big mistake I see people make in the field is that they don't pre-focus. The more your subject is already in focus when you put it into your viewfinder and press your autofocus button, the greater the chances will be that your camera jumps right onto it and that you get some fantastically sharp photos. Whereas if you're completely defocused and you try to focus on something easy, even like a bird flying against the blue sky, many camera systems will have a very hard time finding the subject and sticking to it. So whenever you are out and about in the field, it's crucially important that you pre-focus as much as possible and anticipate in what sort of distance your subject will show up. This will not only help your camera to acquire focus much faster, but it will also help you to cut down the time it takes you from putting up your camera to your face, finding the subject in your viewfinder, and then taking the shot. If you're completely defocused, it's actually very hard to find the subject in your viewfinder, whereas if you're pre-focused, you will be able to find the subject very fast and your camera will be able to lock onto it right away. Another important factor here, especially when you do pre-focusing, is that camera autofocusing systems always work better forwards. So from your camera body onto the subject. Where most autofocusing systems really struggle is if you focus on something past your subject and then the camera has to kind of try and bring it away from the background back onto your subject. So if you're in the field and waiting for a bird to show up, maybe in a tree or fly past you, what I would do is always pre-focus on the closest possible point to you where you think the bird may show up. That helps us in two ways. First of all, we pre-focus in a good distance, so if the bird shows up, we should have it relatively in focus in our viewfinder already. That should help the camera and us to get the shot faster and to acquire focus right away. And secondly, this also guarantees that if the bird shows up a little bit further away, our camera can still move forward and get onto the bird really quickly. Now, I said at the start of the video that I'm not going to talk about settings, and here I am thinking about talking about the setting, but I think it's quite important, so I hope you let me get away with it. What I'm talking about is the subject detection that all or most mirrorless cameras have available. And this is something that you should absolutely use, especially if you want to photograph action. If you're still using a DSLR camera, then you don't have that luxury and you will need to move your autofocusing fields or zones around and try and keep that on your subject. But if you have a mirrorless camera, I would highly recommend that you turn it onto subject detection and let the camera find the subject for you all over the viewfinder. In almost all cases, this will give you significantly better results and will allow you to also track your subjects much easier. If you actually have to try and keep a small zone or an autofocusing point on your subject, it's much harder to actually get the shots that you're after. Whereas with mirrorless cameras and subject tracking, you can actually only focus on keeping your subject in the viewfinder and let the camera do all the work for you. Now I've hyped up the subject tracking autofocus so much and you must think it's the best thing ever and I use it all the time, and I basically do, But sometimes it can drive you crazy because it just cannot find your subject, or you're photographing a bird in the tree, for instance, and the autofocus will just jump onto the leaves and just can't identify the bird for you. And in these cases, it's very handy to assign another autofocusing mode to a different button on your camera. In particular, I like to use spot autofocus with no tracking, which is essentially the same as your DSLR autofocus, where you move an autofocusing field all over your viewfinder, and then when you press the button, it will focus on that exact spot that you moved the autofocusing point to. For instance, this also allows us to easily pre-focus on whichever area we want to pre-focus on. So for all mirrorless cameras, I would recommend that you set up at least 2 buttons. One for spot autofocus and one for the eye tracking autofocus. And if you're a Nikon shooter, you might actually need to set up 3 buttons. One for spot autofocus, one for whole area or wide area autofocus, and one for the 3D tracking. If you're using a camera system where it's easier to use spot autofocus or smaller zone to help the camera identify what's the subject and not get distracted by the elements around it, I often recommend that you use the bird's body as a target and not the head. Especially if the bird's a bit further away, it's almost too difficult to put the focus point onto the bird's head, and the body is a much bigger target for you and the camera. And in most cases, if the bird's a bit further away, the depth of field is still enough that the bird's body and the head are in focus. It's also important to learn how to transform your RAW files into outstanding final images, because even the sharpest image won't look great if we don't polish the RAW file and unleash its true potential. And that is exactly what I teach you in my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses. In there, I guide you through the editing process from start to finish and teach you a fast and easy to follow workflow. And on top of that, I will provide you with my RAW files so you can edit right alongside me. But talk is cheap, right? So don't just take my word for it. Check out all the amazing reviews I've already received from people who have taken my classes and transformed their own editing lives. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore into a rewarding experience because now you will finally know how to do it, make sure to check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses down there in the description. Another important step in your journey towards taking razor sharp and incredible action photos is to learn to anticipate the action. You need to be in the right spot at the right time, have your camera settings dialed in, have pre-focused, and also be ready when it matters the most. Part of this anticipation is not only the pre-focusing, but also sometimes just watching birds. For instance, a bird is sitting in front of you and you're waiting for it to take off. And there's always telltale signs that a bird will take off. Oftentimes birds will do a wing stretch or a sneaky poo before they take off. And whenever I see some of that, that is a clear sign for me that I need to get ready and actually start focusing on the bird already because something cool is about to happen. And these days we actually have a little helper here as well, which is pre-capture. Not all cameras have it, but it's something that will trickle down to more and more cameras going forward. And the ones of you who already have it should definitely use it because it helps us in situations when we're a little bit too slow sometimes. Like the bird takes off and we just miss that moment. Pre-capture will allow us to actually still capture the moment because the camera records a loop of RAW files before we actually fully press the shutter button. So if we are that slight millisecond too late, we will still get the shots. There's one more thing you can do in the field to dramatically increase your keeper rate, and that is to improve your hand-eye coordination. I see many people who rip the camera up to their face only to see that they fail to actually keep their subject in the viewfinder, and then they start looking around through the viewfinder and it actually takes them forever to acquire the target. And by the time they do, the good shots are usually already gone. So if you can actually learn to point your camera at your subject without looking through the viewfinder, you'll be far ahead of the curve and your whole shooting experience in the field will change completely and your keeper rate will completely go through the roof. Now, this is not something that you can easily learn overnight, but I would recommend to practice this whenever you're out and about in the field. Just pick a certain point, like a fence post, for instance, or your dog, and then try to point the camera at it without looking through the viewfinder, and then look through the viewfinder and see if you actually got it into your viewfinder or failed. And the more you practice this, the happier you will be in the field. because, for instance, certain birds will only do a certain pose right after landing, and if it takes you too long to actually find it in your viewfinder, you'll miss all those shots. In this video, I've talked so much about being ready and anticipating the action and setting up your camera for success by pre-focusing that it seems logical if there was a bird right in front of you ready to take off, you would just focus on it the whole time, but this can actually be a mistake. It seems to be the case with basically every camera that I've used. The longer you focus on something, the greater the chances will be that the autofocus will actually jump off your subject. So what I would recommend to avoid is to focus too long on a certain subject. And this can definitely happen, for instance, if you're photographing kingfisher and waiting for it to take off, because you don't always know exactly when it takes off. And sometimes it might take a minute between a wing stretch and the bird actually taking off, and you're tempted to just focus on the bird the whole time, but that's actually a big mistake, because oftentimes in the most crucial moment, the camera will simply jump off your subject and you miss the whole scene because you focus for too long. So my go-to method is usually to focus for a few seconds, make sure I'm perfectly pre-focused, let go, and then focus again, let go, and focus again. This seems to help the camera to stay focused on your subject and not eventually wander off, or when your bird suddenly moves, then jump off the subject. The same is true for birds in flight. You don't want to focus too early on your subject because you dramatically increase the odds of your camera actually losing the subject to the background and you not being able to get the bird back in focus before it's already past you. So when I see a bird coming in from a distance, I like to do something that I call focus bump. So I'll focus on it for a little bit so that I'm nicely pre-focused on it, but then I let the autofocus go again, wait for a little bit, and focus on it again. And only once the bird is very close to where I plan to take the photos, I focus on it and keep focus on it and then start firing away. By using this method, I'm minimizing the odds of the camera just jumping off in the worst moment. As a rule of thumb, I'd say if you're just waiting for your subject to do something, I wouldn't focus on it longer than for 5 or 10 seconds before I give the camera a little breather and then refocus again. That usually has given me the best results and stops the camera from suddenly wandering off your subject. And here is probably the strangest advice for today, and this is one that I've been directly told by several camera manufacturers. All mirrorless cameras have the issue that it's easier for them to focus on something vertical than on something horizontal. So if you're out in the field and you're struggling to acquire focus, especially if it has a lot of sort of horizontal lines in your image, maybe a bird swimming underwater, it can actually help to turn your camera on an angle either to the left or to the right. I know this tip sounds a bit crazy. Why would holding the camera on an angle actually help? But trust me, in certain situations, it can make a big difference. And that brings me to the end of this video. I hope some of these tips will help you to get beautiful razor sharp action shots in the field. And I would love to hear from you guys in the comments. Have you heard about these tips before? Have you heard about the turning the camera on an angle tip? Or were these all completely new to you? Or do you have an advice for all of us? Let us know down there in the comments. Also give me that thumbs up for the video. Check out my channel membership and my masterclasses and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye.